Before the first war, before the first sword, before the first empire built on the bones of the conquered, there was just a field, 2 brothers, and a stone that fit perfectly in the palm of a hand. 1 second. That's all it took to change everything. But what if that second had gone differently? What if the hand had opened instead of closed? What if the world's first murder never happened, and history had to start all over again? Here's what no one tells you. The story of Cain and Abel isn't just a religious tale. It's the operating manual for human violence. Every war, every genocide, every act of revenge humanity has ever committed traces its DNA back to that single moment in a field that no historian was alive to document. So, if we erase that moment, if Cain drops the stone, we don't just save Abel. We potentially dismantle the entire architecture of human destruction. Stay with us, because this is where it gets terrifying. Picture this: 2 brothers standing in an open field, somewhere east of Eden, which, let's be honest, didn't have the best real estate to begin with. The ground is dry, the smoke from Abel's offering is still rising, and Cain's jaw is locked so tight you could sharpen a blade on it. God has just looked at Abel's gift, and then, with the kind of cosmic indifference that makes theologians lose sleep, appeared completely unimpressed by Cain's. No divine explanation, no second chance announced, no customer service hotline for rejected offerings. Just silence and the heat and that stone. Now, in every version of this story we've ever been told, Cain picks it up. The rage wins. The first act of fratricide is committed. The first blood soaks into the first soil, and humanity inherits a template it will spend the next few thousand years perfecting. Every empire that rises from conquest, every revolution that devours its own children, every family feud that drags across generations, all of it echoes, in some dark frequency, the vibration of that original blow. But here's the speculative question that should keep you up at night. What does a human being look like if that moment never happens? Not just Cain and Abel, mind you, but every person who came after them. Because here's the thing about foundational myths. They don't just describe history, they prescribe it. They hand us an identity before we're old enough to argue with it. From the moment a child first hears the story of the brothers, they absorb this buried message that resentment ends in blood, that the defeated must be eliminated, that God's favoritism is worth killing over. It's the world's oldest excuse for violence, disguised as a moral lesson. So we are rewriting it. Today, on this channel, Cain does not pick up the stone. His hand reaches for it, fingers curl around the rough edge, and then something happens. Something small, almost embarrassingly human. He looks at his brother's face, not the face of a rival, not the face of God's favorite, just the face of the boy who used to fall asleep next to him under a sky so full of stars it looked like a second ground above them. And for one impossible, gravity-defying second, Cain chooses differently. He drops the stone, he steps forward, and the world, without knowing it, splits into 2 timelines, the one we inherited and the one we're about to explore. Because in the timeline where that stone hits the ground instead of Abel's skull, history doesn't just change, it mutates into something almost unrecognizable. Something that, when you hold it up to the world we actually live in, feels less like an alternative and more like a wound, because we'll realize exactly what we lost. Now, before we go any further into this alternate history, do something small but important. Subscribe to History Would Be Different if, because this is the kind of content that doesn't survive the algorithm without you. Hit that button. Now let's rewrite the world. Let's be very precise about what just happened, because the universe does not simply absorb an act of radical forgiveness and move on like nothing occurred. When Cain drops that stone, he doesn't just spare his brother's life. He commits what might be the most violent act of self-restraint in all of human prehistory. Because what Cain feels in that moment is not peace, it is not serenity, it is not the warm spiritual glow of someone who just did the right thing and knows it. What Cain feels is a rage so enormous, it has its own weather system, and he chose to stand inside it without swinging. That is not weakness. That is something that civilization has spent millennia trying to bottle, monetize, and consistently failing to manufacture on demand. And it begins, of all places, with a man who had every reason to be the villain of the story. So what happens next? Well, first, And this is the part no one romanticizes properly. It gets deeply awkward. Abel doesn't immediately understand what just occurred. He saw the hand reach for the stone. He felt the temperature of his brother's intention. And now Cain is standing there, empty-handed, breathing like a man who just survived himself. There's no greeting card for this moment. There's no ancient equivalent of, "Hey, sorry I almost killed you, want to grab some bread?" The two of them stand in that field in a silence so loaded it could collapse stars. And then, slowly, because mercy is always slower than violence, Abel takes a step toward his brother. This is where the alternate timeline begins to breathe. Because what happens between Cain and Abel in the aftermath of that almost murder shapes everything that comes after. If they return to their parents, to Adam and Eve, two people already carrying the weight of their own catastrophic choices, they return not as victim and murderer, but as something history has almost no vocabulary for. Two brothers who faced the worst of themselves and chose repair instead. Their parents, who know a thing or two about catastrophic decisions and divine disappointment, recognize something in their sons' faces, something they hadn't managed to model themselves. And here is where the first fracture in our alternate timeline becomes visible, because repair is infectious in ways that resentment can only dream of being. Word travels. Other families, extended early, stumbling across the landscape of a young world, begin to notice that the sons of Adam resolved something without blood. And that, quiet as it seems, is actually a seismic event. Because in our timeline, the lesson humanity internalized from Cain was, when God favors your brother, eliminate him. In this new timeline, the lesson, carried forward by living witnesses, is shockingly different. Confront the darkness in yourself before you project it outward. It sounds simple. It almost sounds naive. But watch what it builds. Because the next generation, the one born into a world where the first famous act of male rage ended in an embrace rather than a funeral, grows up with a different foundational story in their bones. They don't inherit the blueprint for fratricide. They inherit the blueprint for something far more dangerous to empires: accountability. And accountability, it turns out, is one of the most destabilizing forces in human political history. You cannot build a war machine on top of a culture that genuinely asks itself, what did I do wrong, before reaching for a weapon? Something enormous is about to collapse, and we're only getting started. Fast forward 3 generations. In our timeline, by this point, humanity is already deep into its signature genre: violence with increasingly creative justifications. Tribes forming, territories being marked, the concept of the enemy calcifying into culture like a fossil you can't chip out without destroying the whole rock. The architecture of conflict is already load-bearing. Take it out, and everything collapses, which, in our timeline, was never seriously attempted. But in the alternate world, the one born from Cain's open hand, something structurally different is happening inside early human communities, and it's both beautiful and deeply cosmically inconvenient for anyone who profits from chaos. Because here's the ugly truth about peace that the peace movements never put on their posters. A world without violence doesn't become paradise. It becomes complicated in a completely different way, and the complications are, frankly, hilarious. Consider this. In our world, disputes get resolved through dominance. Someone wins, someone loses, the loser shuts up or dies, and civilization lurches forward. It's inefficient, it's brutal, but it is fast. When Cain's alternate choice begins to ripple outward through 3 generations of communities practicing something closer to communal accountability, you get the world's first, and possibly most exhausting, conflict resolution culture. Imagine a meeting, not a quick one, an ancient proto-council where 2 neighboring groups dispute water rights, and instead of one group simply massacring the other and taking the river, they sit down, they talk, they surface grievances that go back 2 generations. Somebody's great-grandfather made a remark at a harvest that still smarts. Someone's grandmother was never properly credited for finding the spring in the first place. The river, almost a footnote now, sits there patiently while humanity discovers the excruciating, necessary art of actually being heard. This is not paradise. This is the birth of bureaucracy, and in a world without weapons of war, it blooms magnificently terrible. The councils grow, the deliberations lengthen, The philosophical frameworks for fairness multiply like rabbits in springtime. And across all of this sprawling, chaotic, maddeningly slow attempt at justice, something extraordinary is being accidentally engineered. A culture of empathy so deeply embedded that it functions less like a virtue and more like a reflex, like breathing, like flinching from fire. 3 generations in, and the communities that descend from the world of Cain who forgave are already developing conflict resolution rituals that make modern diplomacy look like 2 toddlers fighting over a crayon. They have proto-mediators, respected community figures whose entire role is to stand between 2 angry parties and ask the questions nobody wants to answer. They have restorative ceremonies, public, communal, uncomfortable, where harm is acknowledged not just by the one who caused it, but witnessed and processed by everyone around them. They have, in short, stumbled into something that entire modern nations are still desperately trying to institutionalize. And they did it because a man in a field decided to feel his grief instead of weaponize it. But don't get too comfortable with this picture, because here is where the alternate timeline delivers its first genuine gut punch. Not everyone in this world inherited the lesson cleanly. Not everyone 3 generations down the line grew up in one of the communities shaped by Cain's choice. There are outliers, edge communities, groups that received the story second-hand, distorted through retelling, stripped of nuance. And in those groups, something dangerous is fermenting. Because a world that has never practiced organized violence is also a world that has never developed the immune system to recognize it when it finally appears. And it is about to appear, wearing a very friendly face. Here's the thing about a world with no history of war. It produces extraordinary healers, remarkable builders, and breathtaking art. But it also produces the world's most catastrophically naive statesmen. Because statecraft in our timeline was forged inside the furnace of conflict. Every diplomatic protocol, every treaty mechanism, every early warning system for political betrayal, all of it was learned the hard way through disasters that cost enough lives to make the lesson stick permanently in institutional memory. In the alternate timeline, that furnace never got lit. And so when the first truly calculating, manipulative, politically gifted human being arrives on the scene, and one always eventually does, this is not about evil. This is about variance in the human personality spectrum. The communities built on radical forgiveness are profoundly unprepared for what's coming. His name, for the purposes of this thought experiment, doesn't matter. What matters is his method. He doesn't arrive with a weapon. He doesn't threaten or conquer. He arrives with a story, and in a culture that has staked its entire identity on the power of narrative to transform behavior, a sufficiently compelling story is more dangerous than an army. His story goes something like this: your generosity, your openness, your beautiful willingness to restore rather than punish. It is being taken advantage of by the communities on the Eastern Ridge. They receive your mediation, they benefit from your harvests, and they have privately decided that your forgiveness makes you pray. Is it true? It barely matters. Because in a world with no institutional memory of propaganda, in a community with no cultural antibodies against the weaponized narrative, the story lands like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples go everywhere. Suddenly, the proto-mediators are being asked to rule on accusations that cannot be proven or disproven. Suddenly, the restorative ceremonies are being gamed, people showing up to confess minor grievances while concealing strategic intentions. The beautiful machinery of radical forgiveness is encountering, for the first time, someone who has reverse-engineered it as an exploit. And here, right here, is where the alternate timeline delivers the single most unsettling revelation of this entire thought experiment, because the communities do not collapse into war, not immediately, not the way you'd expect. What they do instead is something that, in its own quiet way, is almost more terrifying. They begin to doubt the foundational story itself. They begin to whisper, in the way that scared communities always whisper, that maybe Cain made a mistake, that maybe the stone should have fallen, that maybe the world would have been cleaner, simpler, safer, if the first act of human anger had simply run its course, instead of being interrupted by mercy. This is the moment where the alternate timeline earns its horror movie credentials. Because the greatest threat to a world built on forgiveness isn't the arrival of a single manipulator. It's the speed with which forgiveness can be reframed as weakness by people who are frightened enough. And fear, it turns out, is just as contagious in this world as it is in ours. Maybe more so, because a culture that has never been vaccinated against it has no idea what it's dealing with. The manipulator doesn't need to start a war. He just needs to make people afraid enough to start wanting one, and then watch them do the rest. The most chilling part, he's not even wrong about everything. The communities on the Eastern Ridge are benefiting more than they're contributing. The imbalance is real. The problem isn't the information. The problem is what he's doing with it, and what people are starting to feel in response. Something is about to break, but not the way you'd expect. And the break, when it comes, will rewrite everything we think we know about the relationship between mercy and power. There's a moment in every civilization's history, our timeline included, where the culture reaches an intersection it can only cross once. The path it takes in that moment calcifies into identity so thoroughly that 300 years later, you can still see the original choice embedded in the architecture, the legal system, the stories people tell their children to explain why the world works the way it does. In our timeline, that choice was made for us before we were born. Cain picked up the stone, the template was set, and we have been running that program with increasing sophistication and increasingly industrial-scale consequences ever since. In the alternate timeline, the communities shaped by Cain's forgiveness are now standing at their own version of that intersection, and the pressure on every side is enormous. The manipulator's narrative has done its work. Fear has taken root. The proto-councils are gridlocked. Half the community wants to respond to the Eastern Ridge's imbalance with confrontation, finally, formally, decisively. The other half is clinging to the foundational story, insisting that the method that built everything they have cannot be the method that destroys it. And caught in the middle of this are the mediators, exhausted, increasingly distrusted, holding a framework that has never been stress-tested at this scale. And then something happens that nobody scripted. One of the youngest mediators, a woman as it happens, because of course it's a woman, men have been disastrously overrepresented in the crisis-creating department across both timelines, does something that in our world would barely register as significant. She walks to the Eastern Ridge, not with a delegation, not with prepared statements. Alone. She walks there, and she asks a question that has no precedent in diplomatic history, because in a world without war, no one has ever needed to ask it quite this directly. What do you actually need that you are not receiving? The answer, and this is the part that should land like a fist, is not resources. It's not territory. It's not the things the manipulator had framed the conflict around. What the Eastern Ridge communities need, and have never been able to articulate because no one has ever come and asked without an agenda, is recognition. They need to be seen as contributors, not recipients. They need the story of the community's shared origin to include them as equals, not footnotes. They need the forgiveness culture to apply its own principles to the historical slight of being treated as the lesser branch of the family. Because, in a delicious and terrible irony, the communities built on Cain's radical self-awareness had developed a blind spot about their own quiet arrogance. The revelation hits the proto-councils like a physical force. The gridlock doesn't dissolve immediately. Gridlock never does. This is not a fairy tale, but the manipulator's narrative, which had been feeding on unanswered grievance like a fire feeding on dry wood, suddenly finds its fuel supply interrupted. Because when the actual grievance is finally named, it no longer needs to be weaponized. It can be worked with instead. And work with it they do, painstakingly loudly, with the full procedural drama that a culture of radical accountability generates when it finally turns its tools on itself. What emerges on the other side of this? Crisis is not a utopia. Don't make that mistake. What emerges is something more durable and more interesting than a utopia. A civilization with scar tissue. A culture that has now been tested, has found its own capacity for arrogance and fear and manipulation, has stared down the precipice of violence, and has by the narrowest possible margin chosen differently. Again, for the second time, across 3 generations, the echo of Cain's open hand still reverberating forward through time. But here is the question that this alternate timeline now forces on every single version of us that watches this story. If they can choose it twice, Under pressure, under manipulation, under genuine threat. Why couldn't we? And more unnerving still, did we never choose it? Or did we simply never build the infrastructure to make choosing it possible? Because there's a difference between human nature failing and human architecture failing. And in the gap between those two explanations lives every war that was ever fought, every body that was ever counted, every civilization that built its identity on the ruins of another. Hold that thought, because the final scene is going to make it hurt in the best possible way. Let's come back to the field, the stone, the moment that everything turned on, or, in this alternate reading, the moment everything turned away from. Because there's something we haven't said yet about Cain's choice, something that the religious framing of the story tends to obscure in its rush to deliver a moral verdict. Cain was not a monster. He was a man who received an injustice he didn't understand, from a source he couldn't argue with, in front of the only witness whose opinion he cared about. He was humiliated, confused, and completely alone inside an emotion that had no name yet, because it had never happened to anyone before. The rage he felt wasn't unusual. It was the first iteration of something that has since run in every human heart that has ever wanted. Something it didn't receive. Cain wasn't the exception. Cain was the prototype. That's why the story matters, not because he was uniquely evil, but because he was uncomfortably, recognizably us. And in the alternate timeline, what makes his choice extraordinary is precisely that it happens in the absence of everything we typically require to make good choices. He has no cultural support for forgiveness. It hasn't been invented yet. He has no spiritual community surrounding him. It's a field, not a temple. He has no therapeutic framework, no anger management workshop, no wise elder who has navigated this specific constellation of emotions before. He has nothing except the weight of the stone and the face of his brother and 1 second of something. Call it grace, call it biology, call it an inexplicable misfire in the circuitry of revenge that opens his hand instead of closing it. And from that one open hand, an entire world grows differently, slowly, messily, with its own crises, and its own near disasters, and its own cast of manipulators and frightened councils, and one remarkable young mediator who walks alone to the eastern ridge and asks the question nobody else thought to ask. It doesn't become paradise, but it becomes something that our timeline has been reaching toward, with increasing desperation and decreasing success for every single century of recorded history. A world where the first instinct, when threatened, is to understand before destroying. Now here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you, the punch that makes this not just a thought experiment, but a mirror. The alternate timelines communities didn't achieve what they achieved because they were better people. They achieved it because they had a different story embedded in their foundational identity. They grew up hearing that the first moment of male rage in human history ended with an embrace. That story shaped their reflexes before their reflexes were tested. And our timeline? We grew up hearing that the first moment of male rage ended with a corpse. That the correct response to divine indifference and fraternal resentment is elimination. We've been running that story's logic for so long, we've mistaken it for human nature, when it was always just one possible story among many, crystallized by repetition into something that feels like inevitability. History is not fate. History is narrative, and narrative can be rewritten. One choice, one conversation, one open hand at a time. The question the alternate timeline leaves burning on the table is not, why didn't Cain drop the stone? The question is, every day in our own fields, holding our own stones, standing in front of our own Abels, what are we choosing? And more importantly, what story are we handing to the generation that comes after us? Because they will inherit our choice the same way we inherited Cain's. They will build their identity on the template we leave them. And the weight of that responsibility should feel exactly like a stone in your hand. This has been History Would Be Different If, the channel where we don't just ask what happened, we ask what could have been and why it matters more than we think. If this episode cracked something open in your thinking, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because the conversations that change the world start exactly like this one did, with a single question dropped at the right moment. Subscribe. Stay curious. See you in the next rewrite.